And now we will be hearing more from Adam Eaker, our last speaker of the day. Since March 7th, Adam Eaker has been assistant curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, responsible for the Northern Baroque works in the collection. Until his appointment at the Met, Adam was guest curator and previously Anne L. Poulet Curatorial Fellow here at the Frick Collection. In that capacity, he co-curated the exhibition Van Dyck, Anatomy of Portraiture, which will be open until June 5th and which you will be able to peek into later today. Adam previously worked as a research assistant at the Yale Center for British Art, where he contributed to the catalog Varieties of Romantic Experience, drawings from the collection of Charles Reiskamp in 2010. And he also worked as a researcher for the drawings dealer Martin Müller-Pisani in Hamburg. Adam holds a BA from Yale and an MA and an MPhil from Columbia University, all in art history. And last month, he defended his dissertation on the portraiture of Rubens and Van Dyck, also at Columbia. He was a recipient of a Reggio Fellowship from Columbia and a research fellowship from the Belgian American Educational Foundation, which enabled him to spend a year as a visiting scholar in Antwerp. In addition to his specialization in early modern painting from the Low Countries and England, he maintains strong research interests in German and Scandinavian art. Today, Adam will be speaking about the American Van Dyck. Please welcome Adam Eaker.
Thank you, Esme, for that introduction, and thank you to all of the organizers of this symposium, which I think makes such a nice complement to our exhibition. In a pivotal scene from Edith Wharton's 1905 novel, The House of Mirth, a group of young New York society women appear in a series of tableaux vivants drawn from art history. The setting is the recently built mansion of Mr. and Mrs. Wellington Bry, a parvenu couple who are giving their first major party in Manhattan. To attract the right guests, Mr. and Mrs. Bry enlist the help of a scandalous but well-connected divorcee. While to supervise the artistic arrangements, they recruit a, quote, distinguished portrait painter, probably based on John Singer Sargent. Under the portraitist's supervision, a carefully chosen handful of young women appear before the audience of partygoers in the guise of figures painted by Goya, Botticelli, and other great painters. The novel's heroine, the ill-fated Lily Bart, achieves a coup with her incarnation of Joshua Reynolds' Mrs. Lloyd. At the time that Wharton was writing, this painting had already entered the collection of the Rothschild family and was thus inevitably associated with the novel's themes of wealth and cultured striving. But before Lily's unveiling in this provocative guise, which exposes her long, dryad-like curves, Wharton describes, quote, a young Mrs. Van Alstyne who made a characteristic Van Dyck in black satin against a curtained archway. Mrs. Van Alstyne's Dutch surname connects her with what Wharton earlier in the novel terms, quote, the well-fed and industrious stock of early New York, unquote. In other words, she embodies the established and vetted upper class to which Mr. and Mrs. Wellington Bry aspire. Meanwhile, the Van Dyck costume that Mrs. Van Alstyne wears was one of the most popular forms of fancy dress throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. On the screen, for example, you see a photograph taken of Lady Helen Vincent in the guise of a Van Dyck portrait, worn to a celebrated costume ball hosted by the Duchess of Devonshire in 1897. In the context of Wharton's novel, Mrs. Van Alstyne's choice of costume and her blue-blooded conventionality provide a foil to the socially insecure Lily Bart and her provocative incarnation of Reynolds' Mrs. Lloyd. Not by chance does the novelist have this paragon of New York old money appear in the guise of a Van Dyck portrait. In fact, no artwork so defined social arrival in the mansions of Gilded Age New York as the portraits of Anthony Van Dyck. I am speaking to you this evening in one such Gilded Age mansion, and indeed it houses a splendid collection of Van Dyck portraits. Henry Clay Frick acquired no fewer than 8 paintings by Van Dyck, more than by any other artist. 6 of these portraits form the core of the current exhibition, Van Dyck, The Anatomy of Portraiture, the most comprehensive exploration ever organized of that artist's work in the genre for which he is most famous today. Our exhibition has provided the impetus for this symposium's wide-ranging investigation of American collecting of 17th century Flemish art. In my own remarks, I'll return the focus to Van Dyck, with a particular emphasis on portraits included in our exhibition, which I invite you to visit after we break for the night. In addition to telling the stories of some of the most spectacular acquisitions of Van Dyck paintings by American collectors and museums, I'll explore Van Dyck's significance for American culture and art. As Edith Wharton's novel suggests, Van Dyck has long been indelibly associated with American aspirations toward aristocracy. A highlight of our exhibition is Van Dyck's spectacular portrait of his Roman patron, the Cardinal Guido Bentivoglio, painted in 1623. With this portrait, Van Dyck boldly declared his appropriation of the legacy of Titian and the High Renaissance, throwing down the gauntlet to contemporary Italian portraitists who had painted nothing that rivaled this work in ambition or technical perfection. Already celebrated in Van Dyck's earliest biographies, Bentivoglio's portrait has been one of his most consistently admired paintings. It entered the collection of the Grand Dukes of Tuscany in the mid-17th century and remains at Palazzo Pitti to this day. Indeed, prior to our exhibition, the work had only left Italy once, when looted by Napoleon. Yet despite the fact that it appears before an American public for the first time at the Frick, Bentivoglio's portrait had a surprisingly early and decisive influence on American art. This influence took the form of a copy after Van Dyck's portrait, depicting just the head and upper shoulders of the cardinal, that was painted by the Scottish artist John Smibert while he was studying in Italy around the year 1720. Smibert's copy accompanied the painter when he emigrated to New England less than a decade later. Smibert eventually established himself there as a significant portrait painter, with works such as the Bermuda portrait, now at Yale, having a lasting legacy for American painting. Arguably, however, Smibert's copy after Van Dyck had as much influence as his original portraits. Smibert's Bentivoglio was singled out for praise by such founding fathers of American painting as John Trumbull, who owned the picture and gave it to Harvard, Washington Allston, who admired the copy's, quote, perfection, and John Singleton Copley, who wrote from London to advise his brother to study it as the best example of European painting in Boston. Indeed, Van Dyck played such an influential role in Copley's artistic formation, even before he had seen any authentic works by the artist, that no less an authority than Joshua Reynolds immediately recognized Van Dyck's significance for the young colonial painter. In fact, Copley is the first American artist who can plausibly be said to have carried on Van Dyck's legacy as an innovative portraitist of aristocratic or royal subjects. On the screen, you see Copley's portrait of the 3 youngest daughters of George III, which we might place in a direct line of descent from Van Dyck's own study of 2 daughters of Charles I, included in our exhibition. The curious story of Smibert's Van Dyck's copy and its legacy for American painters such as John Singleton Copley indicates that we would do well to expand our understanding of the history of collecting beyond concrete acquisitions to the circulation of copies, reproductive prints, and other forms of artistic imitation as well. 150 years before great Van Dyck portraits achieved prominent places in American museums and homes, copies and imitations primed American taste to be receptive to the artist. On both sides of the Atlantic, the Nouveau Riche commissioned portraits that emulated Van Dyck in the attempt to establish a pedigree and cultural cachet that was not their birthright. The Frick collection, for example, contains Gainsborough's portrait of the Honorable Francis Duncombe, who appears in Van Dyck fancy dress, much like the costume donned a century later by Mrs. Van Alstyne in Wharton's novel. As I explain in my catalog essay, Frances Duncombe's costume is closely related to the social aspirations of her fiancé's family, whose castles and titles belied their mercantile origins. But Van Dyckian portraits seem to have been especially appealing to artists and patrons working to downplay or romanticize colonial origins. Like John Singleton Copley, Benjamin West was an American-born painter who found fame and success working in London. In one intriguing commission, he provided the eccentric collector William Beckford with a posthumous portrait of Beckford's grandfather, a Jamaican planter, one part of Beckford's larger project of providing his colonial inheritance with a concocted pedigree. West's pseudo-17th century pastiche, now at the Brooklyn Museum, documents the complex transatlantic networks of trade, imitation, and appropriation that influenced Van Dyck's collecting and reception in the centuries after his death. These copies and imitations provide the prelude to the great Van Dyck acquisitions of the Gilded Age. They reveal that the American collectors who purchased Van Dyck portraits as part of their wholesale appropriation of the trappings of English aristocratic culture had already been primed to think of the artist as the chronicler par excellence of noble life. In the context of our symposium, it is important to point out that these 19th century collectors did not primarily think of Van Dyck in terms of Flanders or Flemishness. He was rather collected as the head of the British school, a status long claimed for him by English painters themselves. In 1715, a few years before Smibert painted his copy of Bentivoglio, Jonathan Richardson Sr. declared that, quote, "When Van Dyck came hither, he brought face painting to us, ever since which time, that is above 80 years, England has excelled all the world in that great branch of art." In the 19th century, exhibition programs shored up this association between Van Dyck and the English School of Portraiture. For example, at a major monographic exhibition held at the Grosvenor Gallery in 1887, Van Dyck was presented, in Alan Staley's words, as, quote, "a foreign-born English portraitist, the starting point of what was once again, after a period of eclipse, perceived as a great tradition which flowered in the late 18th century in the work of Reynolds and Gainsborough, and which was seen to be flowering again at the end of the 19th, unquote. Van Dyck thus represents an anomaly among the Flemish artists we will be discussing in the course of this symposium. Whereas painters like Jordaens, Teniers, or Brouwer might have been seen to embody certain earthy qualities of a quintessential Flemishness, Van Dyck was far more associated with the national characteristics, however fancifully construed, of his adopted home in England. The collecting of his portraits provides one chapter in the larger history of American Anglophilia. A year before the Grosvenor Gallery exhibition, one of Van Dyck's greatest British portraits, depicting the Duke of Lennox and Richmond, had gone to an American collector for the princely sum of $40,000. The painting was acquired in 1886 by Henry Marquand, one of the important early benefactors of the Met, to which he would give the painting in 1889. And here I draw upon the research of Cynthia Saltzman and Esme Quadbach. A depiction of one of the leading aristocrats at the court of Charles I, the Duke's portrait had since the 18th century been in the collection of the Methuen family at Corsham Court. Finding himself in straitened circumstances, Lord Methuen had first approached the National Gallery in London about selling works from his celebrated family collection. When the trustees of the gallery failed to make him an offer, however, he was forced to look farther afield. Learning of the availability of the pictures, the London-based dealer Charles Deschamps brokered a purchase of the Duke's portrait by Marquand, along with a few other pictures from Corsham. Describing his purchase, Marquand justified this transfer of cultural capital from the old to the new world in terms of national edification. He wrote, "I know it must be a struggle to part with such old friends. They will, however, educate a new country and do good service, I trust, where they are going." Marquand's notion that the Duke's portrait, along with his other purchases, would educate a new country encapsulates the pedagogical imperative behind much collecting activity in the Gilded Age. Just as Smibert's Bentivoglio copy had inspired several generations of painters in 18th century Boston, Marquand's Duke of Richmond would become a cynosure of the newly founded Met. Two of Van Dyck's preparatory drawings for the portrait are included in our exhibition, but to see the work itself, you will need to walk up Fifth Avenue, where the Duke guards the entrance to the European Paintings curatorial offices, and where I'm delighted to greet him every day on my way to work. Tellingly, Marquand had sought out the advice of John Singer Sargent when making this purchase, and as Cynthia Saltzman has observed, Sargent in turn paid tribute to the collector by painting his own Van Dyckian homage, a portrait of Marquand's wife. Described by Rodin as, quote, "the Van Dyck of our times," Sargent's European orientation and art historical sophistication conferred a new level of international recognition on American portraiture. By the late 19th century, the new nation not only had actual Van Dyck portraits hanging on the walls of its flagship museum, but it had also produced a painter who could plausibly be considered Van Dyck's artistic heir. Inevitably, the movement of ancestral portraits from aristocratic collections to American museums stirred up a great deal of controversy. This was particularly the case with a group of Van Dyck's Genoese portraits that, as we heard earlier, left Italy in the first decade of the 20th century under dubious circumstances, reportedly rolled up and stuffed in an exhaust pipe to be driven across the border. And on the screen you see one of these Genoese portraits now at the Frick, which has been specially conserved for our exhibition. One British editorialist defended the sales of these Van Dyck portraits, declaring, quote, "Portraits of Italian noblemen may or may not be out of place in the private residence of a Chicago pork butcher, but they are there at all events properly cared for and open to the enjoyment of all properly accredited connoisseurs," unquote. Portraits play a special role in narratives of dynastic and cultural continuity. Displayed in a sequence, they make genealogy visible. The alienation of portraits from their ancestral collections threatened this ideal by turning aristocratic identity into a commodity that any Chicago pork butcher could acquire, and making Van Dyck portraits a particularly potent signifier for this controversial transfer of cultural capital from the old to the new world. Another Frick acquisition featured in our show, the portrait of Lady Anne Carrie, later Countess of Clanbrassil, can provide a case study of the fraught social and political circumstances in which Americans made their acquisitions of Van Dyck portraits. This painting, a classic example of Van Dyck's female portraiture, regularly appeared in British and European exhibitions until Henry Clay Frick was able to acquire it in the midst of World War I. A reviewer who saw it at the Royal Academy in 1875 as part of a group of Van Dyck portraits from the collection of the Earl of Denbigh captured the appeal of the artist to contemporary collectors as the portraitist of a doomed generation of English aristocrats. He wrote, "Wherever a portrait of Van Dyck hangs, it presides. Wherever his pictures muster, they dominate. In this case, they give the tone, they fill the eye and the mind, they summon up the past which was the little day of their subjects. They bid us pause and meet their gaze, haughty, sad, commanding, dignified from men's eyes, soft, sweet, pure, and lofty, never touched with frivolity from those of women. And they tell us in that pause how the court painter lived a life of presage on the eve of a great historical convulsion and gathered these flowers of grace and loveliness from the brink of ruin." Another great historical convulsion, the First World War, would eventually allow Henry Clay Frick to acquire Lady Anne Carrie, as documented by surviving correspondence in the Frick Art Reference Library. In a letter dated March 30th, 1916, Captain A.E. Stanley Clark wrote to Frick to offer him works from, quote, "my family collection," and lamented, "Alas for these times, nobody in England is now buying, and it is very difficult to sell anything here." A few weeks later, Frick declined through his secretary to pursue Clark's offer. On May 5th, 1916, Clark again approached Frick, this time acting as a middleman to assess his interest in an even more desirable painting. He wrote, "There is a particular matter I should like to put before you. On behalf of the Earl of Denbigh, who is away on active service in Egypt, I have undertaken to find a private purchaser for his famous painting of the Countess of Clanbrassil by Sir A. Van Dyck, and it occurs to me that being a very exceptional picture, you would be interested in it. Offers of £40,000 for this painting have been refused some years ago, and before the war, Lord Denbigh refused to sell it, but owing to war losses, he has now asked me to find a private purchaser and will accept £30,000. His lordship will give you a written guarantee with the picture, and the only conditions are that the purchaser allows a copy of the work to be painted and that the original frame be left." Lord Denbigh's stipulation that the work be copied reveals an astonishing reversal in the buying power of American and British collectors. Whereas in the 18th century, Americans had gone into transports over Smybert's copy of Van Dyck with no hopes of ever laying eyes on an original, at the dawn of the 20th, it was English aristocrats who had to content themselves with mere replicas. Initially, however, Frick declined the offer of Lady Anne Carrie, with his secretary replying on May 23rd that the collector already had 5 Van Dyck portraits, quote, "otherwise he would consider the purchase of the one you write of." Henry Clay Frick was notoriously taciturn about his motivations for collecting specific works, and it is difficult to tell him what caused him to change his mind about this portrait. In any case, he decided to commission an evaluation of the work from Karel F.L. de Wilde, who declared it to be, quote, "one of the finest examples of the art of Anthony Van Dyck and entirely painted by the master himself." unquote. By the time de Wilde submitted his appraisal, however, Frick had already acquired the painting. A receipt dated November 17, 1916, documents the final purchase through the firm of Lewis and Simmons, indicating as well that the Earl was ultimately persuaded to part with both the portrait and its, quote, original carved gilt frame. These spectacular purchases stimulated the public imagination, with such headlines as Van Dyck portrait sold for $50,000 regularly appearing in American newspapers at the turn of the century. The name of the artist thus became a recognizable brand, closely associated with the swagger and confidence of new American wealth. But Van Dyck also became a household name for other reasons. On the screen, you see an illustration of fashionable beard styles that ran in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch on January 16, 1895. The accompanying article declares that probably the prevailing Van Dyck point effect with closely cropped jowls is the most generally adopted fashion that has ever obtained among young men in America. Some young dandies have the knack of training a Van Dyck beard to a nicety without the least trouble. Others are not so fortunate and grow hollow in the chest and weak in the knees over their efforts. The article took a humorous vantage point on what was by then 2.5 centuries of Van Dyck influence on the appearance and self-presentation of aristocrats and their emulators. Of course, portraits were not the only paintings by Van Dyck to enter American collections. Tomorrow, I'll discuss the history of the Met's collection of Flemish Baroque paintings, which included this depiction of St. Rosalie as one of its very first acquisitions. In 1914, the Duke of Newcastle offered Van Dyck's Rinaldo and Armida, which you see on the right, originally commissioned by Charles I at auction. The bid of the Baltimore businessman Jacob Epstein was rejected on the grounds that he was an unknown purchaser. When he finally succeeded at acquiring the painting in 1927 for $250,000, his purchase made the front page of the New York Times. Epstein gave the painting to the Baltimore Museum of Art in 1931, and it is without doubt the most important history painting by Van Dyck in the United States. Nevertheless, it is portraits that constitute the bulk of Van Dyck's production and that have continued to excite collectors up to the present day. In 2014, a Los Angeles-based collector acquired a Van Dyck self-portrait from the collection of the Earl of Jersey, leading to a national outcry in the United Kingdom. After government officials placed an export stop on the work, the National Portrait Gallery was able, in a public appeal, to raise the 10 million pounds needed to acquire the painting and, quote, save it for the nation. This rhetoric recast the patrimony threatened by the global market for portraits as national, not dynastic. The image of a cultural hero, Van Dyck's self-portrait is said to belong to the British people. Van Dyck was among the most cosmopolitan of artists, with a career that stretched from Antwerp to Palermo and London. For this reason, cultural nationalists in his native Flanders have frequently treated him with ambivalence. Yet the National Portrait Gallery's campaign is a remarkable testament to the persistence of his portraits in the cultural pantheon of his adopted home. The attempt to preserve national patrimony necessarily clashes with a global art market in which paintings by Van Dyck continue to command high prices. Yet both demonstrate the artist's enduring appeal. In his portraits, Van Dyck crafted a rhetoric of aristocratic entitlement so successful that succeeding generations of collectors, divided by war, revolution, and massive social change, have claimed it as their birthright. Thank you.